Hello everyone, today we talk about Renaissance symbols, heraldry and religious meaning in the, not just interreligionary, but general warfare taking place across Eurasia during the same era. This is quite important for a number of reasons. First of all, there is an era on its own that we don't stress too much on Schwerpunkt because essentially my narrative is that there wasn't such a thing like a modern era. In fact, I still don't believe there is. But this shouldn't make you neglect what we conventionally chronologize as the modern era. And especially also not shying away from scanning it further into different phases. The other aspect is, of course, the traditional continuity of symbology from ancient times that gets re-edited, redeveloped, and applied. The different contexts that show in many ways both that, of course, modernization, secularization from one side, also forgetfulness, even a confusion. Right, or the rejection, as we will see now today, for example, of traditional symbols, because one power had become so much sort of connected with it that it sort of brought to a general malaise, like even the idea of using that same symbol at the same time, even though it was present also from the other side, that, however, had developed others, right? So there is yet another sphere that is heraldry, is a bit this antiquary taste towards also like arcane knowledge and how this was being cumulated, analyzed, in part revived even from during the Renaissance, as you know, from the classical era and its original meanings, but again, in the same Renaissance forms that we understand here. Then, of course, there is the human factor as well. We know different sources literally talking to us about these issues at a time that, as we've seen also very often in the strictly military historical sphere, were particularly aware of the issue. And so by being read, really offer you the unique experience of literally listening to a person who lived at the time, explain you what the odd was. We're talking symbols like the cross, the crescent, that in many ways could summarize especially the great Catholic Ottoman struggle of the era, but that, as we've seen very often in other videos about the Renaissance, are not quite only the same thing, because crescents were used in the flags of many Islamic allies of the Catholic cause. There is a Protestant breaking of Catholic unity at this point. There are different alliances across the board. Think about the impious fetus of France with the Turk, also the general Protestant sabotage of the Habsburgic cause that would be instead listened to by the Persians, Shia Persians. So we see, by the way, a lot of different symbols in a veritable heraldic forest. Eagles, lilies, suns, lions, forming a veritable heraldic tapestry perfectly suited to depicting the Eurasian-Mediterranean dynamics from the late 14th century through the mid-18th one. So we're talking about very late in time. Just the other day we were talking about the Crimean War that display, in that sense, crosses and crescents fighting against, for example, other crosses. There were eagles from both sides and more. But this was just 1 century before, right? We will not arrive necessarily that late in time. Today we focus mostly on this late medieval, early modern period in general. But you understand, for this reason, even just only like the centuries representing a vast span covering what we traditionally label the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the early modern period, stretching from the mid-14th century crisis to the threshold of the so-called Industrial Revolution, which is not just a big deal in a chronological sense, but as you know, in a traditional, cultural, political, ideological sense. That's the era that I would like to mostly focus on. Yes, it does normally overlap chronologically with the early modern age, but it was characterized, as we often described it, mostly by a continuity of what we intend as the Middle Ages, or at least the later Middle Ages, the post-big civilization, medieval civilization crisis, arriving to a point of brusque acceleration in parallel with modernization and secularization that, however, made us forget too quickly in the last couple of centuries or so. This period in between that, in this sense, deserves a sort of appreciation akin to the medieval one, right? If we understand the Middle Ages, something that is squeezed between two different eras with a specific spiritual temper and level of sort of human virtue / degeneration. So this era brimmed with monumental geographical explorations and technological breakthroughs that have become a bit the hallmark of the period. Especially the more you go on, like, you would think that the scientific and the philosophical upheavals come to define this. We have sometimes confused ideas, like, for example, most of what was produced philosophically in the 18th century was already neatly or even better expressed in the 17th, which in turn naturally drew heavily from previous centuries and even antiquity, and even beyond, right? If you, depending on how far you want to stretch tradition historically. Of course, the reason why we don't see things too well sometimes is normal, is really tied to our preconceptions, to the ways we have been taught or not taught, by the way, history. The newer generations are being completely severed from that kind of cultural background we had up to a few decades ago, from family, from school. It depends also where you come from largely, but there is a problem from one side in reinvigorating this kind of awareness, but at the same time, like, there is a chance to restarting it, rebooting it from a tabula rasa that could also reestablish the right foundations where they're just a reason, a motive. This was actually true for all human history, but as you understand, there is something wrong happening. In any case, the early modern age well expressing this in the change in the modes of thought, production, consumption, and existence. Historiography has, in a sense, even overly stressed this, because, again, at large, we're talking the Ancien Regime, and so something that more or less in the fundamentals had been frozen by the mid-14th century and was just sort of slightly starting to move, to re-expand through also really new means that hadn't really been seen before. During this time, the strengthening of the colonial framework and the so-called sort of asymmetrical exchange ushered in the initial wave of what we now term globalization. I'm not going to discuss these terms because, in my opinion, do not really mean much at all, and they bear very wrong conceptual mistakes, especially in the ways they're weighed, right? Asymmetry is always there, right? The reason to say this, we know it very well from military history, from our Clausewitzian background. War is asymmetric by definition. There isn't such a thing like conventional warfare, not by conventional language, right? That does not represent the reality of war. Globalization, regardless of sort of the scale of the powers on a global stage, so in a merely geographical sense, doesn't also make much sense in the sense that empires had always meant to be global to a degree. So people using this, oh my God, they're trying to globalize us, like as if anything else ever happened, especially without understanding what that goal practically is, which is also a deeply traditional role, right? Being anti-global is pretty dumb. Like, you may be against specific policies that you do not like in the way that globalization is carried out, but if you have any traditional worth as a human being, your sole purpose should be universal, ecumenic, which means global, by the way. Of course, the anti-traditionalism spreads among the lesser people that, of course, are terrorized by the idea that somebody can wield power as they evidently can't themselves. Nevertheless, simultaneously, we witness to some veritably epoch-changing dynamics, such as the shift from feudal monarchies to so-called centralized, or at least ever more concentrated states. Somebody would use the term absolutist, which also does not mean much, because the only absolute state, at least in a juridical institutional sense, was the one established with the Code Napoleon, which marks the beginning of the contemporary era. In fact, it has nothing to do by definition with the modern one, the one that had just preceded it. And that, of course, lays in the concept that the state is the sole source of law, which is a big deal indeed, surely in an anti-traditional sense, but not in a formally wise and in some ideological ways. But in fact, tradition does not disappear with that, nor this idea of power concentration is actually, especially in the moment in which you, in fact, don't understand it as a substitution of natural divine right, a problem as far as power wielding is concerned. So that Frederick the Great, Maria Theresa, Catherine the Great would have wished to be absolute monarchs. And if you know anything about the history of their countries, the point is they couldn't be. They were trying to be something like that, but they couldn't boast an absolutistic principle even in front of their subjects, because their constitutions were fundamentally opposite to the concept. And in fact, this is also post-traditional modern secular terminology that mostly has been sort of created by the fourth estate or third estate to antagonize with the traditional order. Of course, as we were speaking before, perhaps the biggest deal in front of which, for example, the discovery of the New World is practically irrelevant by itself. It's not that it wasn't, of course, the rise of the Reformation, right? So this sparked by the same secularization of authority, and so being a profoundly anti-traditional dynamic that mostly ignites, really triggers most of this changes especially at a moral and scientific level, which also is paralleled in a chronological sense by the gradual formation of the Jus Publicum Europaeum that we have studied for our History of Law series, and that is actually a much more complex thing, which in fact was pursued in many ways by the same so-called absolutist rulers in virtue of its actually universal meaning, and that in some ways was, however, derailed as well towards a sense of, at least depending how instrumentalized it was, towards the affirmation of fragmentary status quo, right, of an anti-universal, anti-traditional order of essentially states that had no other foundations but themselves, and so reducing further the sacrality, like the closeness of God and man, forgetting the entire point of the empire. So such issues that we can't even begin to digress on, because otherwise we will never finish. But as you know, on Schwerpunkt you can find plenty of these considerations. The age we're discussing today is also one when grand political religious ideologies and their associated universal social legal systems, namely the papacy and the empires, as we just said, began to fray and face crisis, because they were there and they would actually remain. This is the point of the early modern age that gets often misunderstood. We truly don't have an end of those. I mean, the papacy still even exists, and the empire ended in the 19th century without any form of replacement in a historical sense, also because even those states that claim those kind of things are based on completely anti-traditional concepts that stemmed even from, the Bolshevik Revolution, that is a bit difficult to reconcile with any trace of human dignity aside from tradition. And it's not, of course, a coincidence. There is no doubt that this fragmentation took place, though, and so there is a deep crisis in the traditional institutions that mirrors the gradual degeneration of mankind towards the abyss. even when this forces, or especially because they continuously reshape themselves. At the same time, there's a bold new perspective centered on individual rights and privileges surging forth that, in a sense, is what we were just talking about before, and that we too often mistake for properly Western civilization. Western civilization has practically nothing to do with this. I explained countless times how the idea, for example, having a compact body of citizens in arms is something as old as the Indo-European world. You don't have, you can edit it in new terminological, institutional fashion, but this is not really between a single guy who rules everybody versus as a traditional thing versus people that are actually powerful and that share a more egalitarian system. Here we're talking about how much they earned that and how much that level of human worth is actually incorrectly described by the institutions. In other words, I, for example, advocate for for a sort of civic rights patent of sort. I don't think that most people deserve most of the civic rights they have. At the same time, I don't think they should be deprived of any civic right. It's just who decides at what age you can have sex or drive a car or vote, right? It's basically the same exact principle that we constantly reinstate, and that is basically applicable to different degrees that by now do not even seem necessarily negotiable. I'm also in line of principle. I'm okay with that, and I say this because not because in fact I'm an advocate for this or that necessarily, or at least I could be, but this is not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that we tend to mistake Western civilization for it's just what we have here now in the 20th, 21st century as essentially as an ultimate accomplishment that should work. And is working forever. By the degree certain things work best, like never before in the history of mankind, I agree that should be maintained, but we can simply also improve depending on just the objective merit of individuals. And so also the idea that, in fact, our Western civilization in a modernistic or secularistic sense is crystallized in some standard you can read somewhere, well, it's actually not there, right? Every state, for example, has a different constitution, and still, we are Westerners, and we are united, and we are strong. So this is especially the most amazing aspect of Europe, and anyone who sort of shares that, also have, European offspring, shares that kind of Western identity, that proves my point, or proves this point, that is, there are certain fundamentals that go beyond merely legalistic or formalistic rules that evidently are the only thing we actually only have. Do human rights exist in an absolute sense, in a metaphysical sense? Of course they don't. It's an anti-traditional concept. Do they work in some way in the moment in which today's governments sort of enforce some of that? Because also they can't simply enforce everything, because in fact there is an extreme there that nobody can ever touch, even as a government. Yes, to a degree. To others, they really don't. The point here is not exchanging these talks for something that is merely within the box of this kind of political debate. Is simply having a moral and scientific capacity of describing this from a historical and cultural standpoint in a way that is as objective, as accurate as possible. And this is what on Schwerpunkt we really do. Now, spanning 3 to 4 centuries, this period we discussed today was marked by a political and interstate tension that wove an intricate, ever-shifting network of alliances and enmities. In other words, welcome to the reality of the world since ever. Never make the mistake of thinking that there is actually a pre-Westphalian or post-Westphalian border. It's a pile of BS, the states. What are states, really? Was there even ever a moment in which a state was just a singular absolute reality where nothing. Current events show how that's basically not true. Like, countries have always clashed against one another, have always tried to destroy one another, to subjugate revolts, to cause regime changes, to, like, even colonize, settle into others, etc. And the product is what we see today. It's actually also our national identities. And so to presume this is just something strange, even in today's world, is a deep political and historical mistake. I'm not expressing, you see, my historical philosophy, right? I'm not even expressing a judgment whatsoever. I'm not saying, this is bad, this is wrong, this is good, this is right. I'm simply telling you this is what happens. Then, of course, there is a merit, a quality, right? There is the winner and the loser. There is who's right, who's wrong. And also that, in fact, is more tight than it seems in a traditional metaphysical sense. But the point is, let's acknowledge, first of all, that there isn't such a thing like what we have been habituated to approximate, like for conventional, sometimes even just didactical purposes, right? You don't have to be denying, a country's sovereignty, independence, self-determining right if you deny that there was ever a post-Westphalian reality, right? Simply that if that happens by different degrees, and it's interesting historically to see how that happens. And that's why personally I like history, and I'm also a military historian for that matter. Now, initially, the intricate medieval interplay between Christendom and Islam, defined by military confrontations yet enriched by vibrant commercial and cultural exchanges involving a diverse cast such as the perpetually Latin or Western Christian realm, the Greco-Byzantine or Eastern Sphere, and the Sunni and Shia caliphates, as well as the Tartar domain, with its steady Islamization, appears to have given way from at least the 15th century onward to a stark and ruthless balance of fear, right? This is also a perspective distortion, considering especially the big elephant in the Western Eurasian room, that is, of course, the Ottoman Empire. That is also something that we haven't really talked about much more than in a strictly military sense, but that by starting at some point soon, some modern history manualistic content we will have to look at in some deeper depth. The idea of blocks, as you know, is pretty foreign to Schwerpunkt. We do not really accept the notion, as we just said, I just said that the post or pre-Westphalian world in this category does not exist as we intended. You can imagine, a dualistic kind of block idea. Not even the Cold War really had blocks, if you really look at it carefully. And yet, of course, power concentration is the degree we should orient ourselves to. And despite the growing complexity of the world stage, driven by the emergence and evolution of new entities and circumstances across the New World, Asia, and Africa, developments long dismissed as minor, but which later profoundly reshaped the broader landscape of relations and power, the contest for dominance now played out between the Mediterranean and Central Eastern Europe. Right? You know that on Schwerpunkt this is a leitmotif. I believe that at large, Western culture in the last centuries or so, mostly, right up to, I would say, the beginning of the 20th century, was a broader awareness of this, but has gradually neglected, especially with the rise of the Anglo-American hegemony. And this is just something that happened. Again, I'm not expressing a judgment on this, but it's just, I think, a matter of fact, has fundamentally forgotten, or at least downplayed or misrepresented the Mediterranean and Central Eastern Europe, right? This is something you can easily see. We don't even reason sometimes as if, for example, a Central Europe existed. For us, mostly the lines we look at are drawn during the Cold War, after World War II or something. And it's not like there isn't a point to that. Of course, after especially the First World War, there was a great redrawing of not just European political boundaries, but as a consequence also the ones of the world. There is this such, in fact, also Anglo-American rise in hegemony in the last couple of centuries. But other examples, I don't know how much you think that Southern Europe is, generally speaking, like a poor place where actually like there are pretty wealthy countries that are even wealthier than some Central or Northern European ones. And just how much, for example, we do not understand the difference between Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, before the war in Ukraine, did even bother to know, for example, Ukrainian history? I mean, seriously, you have to be honest about this. People fundamentally do not know their history. It's not just like we study Anglo-American history better, for that matter. I think that even as continental Europeans, we do a pretty poor job at that. So the truth, as I was saying before, is that as humans, we've been degenerating to the point of course, like even our historical knowledge at large is pretty ridiculous. But the fact that the early modern age, specifically for today's topic, was in many ways witnessing a massive attritional effort in the Mediterranean, in Central Eastern Europe, doesn't matter how true that was also for Western Europe, the colonies, etc., but is importantly neglected. Is mostly seen as some sort of exotic thing. Like, we don't even picture the civilizational scale involved, right? Think about, I don't know, the fact that Italian was the language of modern Europe, or that there was probably a Holy Roman Empire led by the Habsburgs that risked to witness Germany basically invaded and Vienna conquered by the Ottomans on multiple occasions. The fact that when we talk about the Ottomans, we see a plethora of actually also Christian European peoples living in Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, the Balkans, etc., that are actually also from that side. We also tend to deal with, for example, the Byzantine legacy as something, okay, well, 1453, the Byzantines are over. It's just like a paradox came knocked out from the map. We're talking about kind of the same world that we got so familiar with just by studying medieval history. And we tend to much easily erase such, in fact, local dynamics against kind of overgeneralizations. As if, I don't know, in the Ottoman Empire, I think it was just a uniform Islamic bloc that didn't have any internal logic, that didn't interplay with various European countries at this point. I could digress on this too, but I think we have to discuss things thoroughly time by time, so there will be plenty of occasions, hopefully, to do so. We're already done, right? If you go, for example, into the mostly the 16th to 17th century history playlists, you will fundamentally find a lot of this stuff, right? Habsburgic, Papal, Ottoman history. We talk about. By the way, what about Poland and Lithuania? Do we want to discuss that? Do we want to discuss that they came knocking at literally at the Muscovite gates? Do we want to simply acknowledge that the same peoples that live today owned such kind of power dynamics, and that at large, like, things can even change faster at this point than ever? This is a problem in terms of historical analysis. I mean, if you don't picture what happened in the past, history, and even just the present, does not get dissected simply on kind of narrow temporal and local basis. You must know the entire picture, because otherwise, where do you even start with, and what kind of judgment can you express in the merit? Now, the aforementioned struggle playing out between the Mediterranean and Central Eastern Europe feature two distinct socio-political and religious blocs each internally complex and far from harmonious, as we already pointed out. On one side stood Western Christendom, fragmented into numerous states and riven by disputes between those loyal to the Church of Rome's authority and those pursuing the arduous, often violent quest for pristine Christian purity through the Reformatio Deformatarum Rerum, so a movement that in practice birthed a prolonged, fierce, and occasionally, or more habitually actually, a radical array of proposals to redefine Christianity. And also about this, we surely also the Anglo-American world, because of the Protestant, largely Protestant basis of it, has, for example, very strongly emphasized, of course, the relevance of the Reformation, and rightly so. We've seen this also in the way, for example, the Dutch or the Swedish military systems figure in practically any kind of disclosure, Renaissance warfare as some kind of radically important chapters on their own, and sort of the rest is, well, okay, but, the others were either papists or whatever. And of course, we have also highlighted how much this even stemmed from the actual times Protestant propaganda, which, again, is absolutely to respect as any propaganda that is able to live so long. But history is also much else, right? This is not a period where the other parts of Europe had not enough evidence to actually dig so much, and even with a certain ease, in spite of the overabundance of sources that start really becoming a problem even from my 14th century period onwards. But there is a flip to this, because actually, if you look at the map, even of the greatest expansion of Protestantism, you realize that Protestantism at large spread among the least developed parts of Europe, right? And also the myth of Protestant ethics and etc. It's basically nonsensical. I mean, ask the Hungarians or the Scottish whether their Calvinism made them successful countries, as a matter of fact. Or also just look at what, the Inquisition dealt with people as opposed to any Protestant government of the time. The Inquisition was by far the single most garantistic and fair and objective and capable judicial one of the era. Like in the Protestant world, you could simply be burned at the stake in the moment. And this is not really and it continued far beyond. I mean, by the mid-16th century, cardinals in Rome would have laughed at the idea of burning a woman as a witch. Like in New England, this continued up to the 18th century. So the question is, what are we actually looking at? Because if you haven't seen this in historical perspective, you truly, and you can answer, you don't have to answer me of this, but you can answer yourself. Do you really know anything of this? Like, have you ever extensively read about the period, or if the answer is no, if you at least still believe that in this, I don't know how, I presume this is at large the common, the mainstay of the situation. Of course, I think people who are more into history, generally speaking, tend to know more of the difficulty, at least in the defense of these preconceptions. But what are we, let's say, as Westerners, how can we actually recover our own historical awareness if we even can't start from this basic elementary notions? It's pretty complicated. As you understand today, I'm not really running, but of course, in order to introduce the topic that we still haven't touched, we must explain why and how we get there, right? So, this was Western Christendom, by the way, that was effectively broken in a strictly confessional sense. And on the other side emerged the rising Ottoman power, projecting an image, just an image though, of unity and coherence, at least externally perceived so, as having not merely dominated but absorbed the older Islamic world, complete with its variances, rifts, and rivalries, that instead continued to exist, while also assimilating Byzantine culture and society, positioning itself, willingly or not, and whether grasped at the time by the Western Christians or not, or accepted, say better, as their inheritor rather than their annihilator. I mean, just the other day, talking about the Crimean War, we've seen how basically the casus belli was revolving around what kind of Christian nation the Ottomans would have favored to exercise a spiritual influence over the large Christian community that still lived within the Ottoman Empire, and of course in the Holy Land in Jerusalem. We tend to forget this too often, what also the Ottoman Empire was in terms of sheer sort of traditional organization. The fact that the Ottomans, for example, bore the title of Caesars of Rome, of course, something that they had bestowed on themselves, and that they were also greatly admiring the West. Constantinople was plenty, as you know, of Western ambassadors, instructors, artists, etc. So we can't treat this world, first of all, as distant from us, at least more than much, also because, as we've seen very often, at least in different videos, the Westerners had historically already dominated what we call the Byzantine world. The Ottomans had fundamentally filled the vacuum because, in a sense, this was a reaction to the same Western Christendom. Definitely the Greeks opened the gates to the Turks, preferring the Sultan to the Pope. There is much more to this, including like the fact that the West was so truly dominant in many ways that even during the wars with the Ottomans did not properly feel pressured enough by the urgency of dealing with this major threat. And in fact, we tend to, at the same time, overestimate and underestimate the Ottomans. And again, now I will not explain exactly what I mean, but I made so many videos about the Ottoman Empire, and will continue to do so, that this is not, after all, too important for today's topic again. Now, the extent period of cultural and commercial interactions between Christian communities and the Islamic realm appeared in its overarching patterns to have reached its conclusion, paving the way for a fresh era rooted in diplomatic and political standoffs on one side and the harsh equilibrium of military might on the other. Not so much clash of civilizations, but rather a contest of powers. This is profitably debatable because, as you know, the Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean was as violent, as brutal, and some of the most glorious pages in Western military history pass through, in fact, innumerable victories and defeats against the Ottomans, again, from Mediterranean to Central Europe. Think about how much, I don't know, the Venetians or the Croats or the Austrians or the Poles fought against the Turks in some of, again, the bitterest clashes in the modern age that, in this sense, too, are often neglected. I mean, how many people get really into the depths, the details of, I don't know, Hungarian or Cossack or, you know, Muscovite military history at this point at large. And again, there were interesting power shifts as well in the relation with the Turks. For example, Moscow and Constantinople had, via the Ottomans themselves, this power-sharing situation for which they decided to make up the notion that, in fact, Moscow was somehow inheriting the patriarchate of all the Rus, which actually remained constantly within what was effectively now Poland, Lithuania, in Ukraine, in the Uniate Church of the Ruthenians, that also kept living at a point under the Habsburgs rather than in any other sort of Eastern context, which also, as you know, entailed a very deep relation with Rome, with the papacy. It is also true, however, that aside from military history, as we just stated now, for example, from a religious point of view, there is a much greater level of machination between also what was becoming more easily identifiable as the Turk, the Great Turk, and basically any other power that could sort of get something in exchange, favors, threats, depending on the situation. And it is as messed up as it sounds. We've seen it many times. Also because that original idea that, again, Christians should have simply united, I mean, in time of Protestant Reformation, really, against the Turks or the Muslims appeared ever more idealistic and romantic. Also in positive terms, for example, having North African Islamic allies to the Habsburgs, to Spain, that fought actively against the Ottomans, that in fact were not pretty much appreciated by their neighboring co-religionaries. We should also understand better a bit the nature of Ottoman power. We partially discussed this from a strategical point of view when discussing, for example, like the real size of Ottoman armies, how this normally operated in the frontiers, etc. When we look at the Ottoman Empire in a strictly, it's even improper to call it national basis, but let's say its core lands was fundamentally Rumelia and Anatolia. Like all the rest, from Ukraine to Sudan, was at some point controlled, but mostly through this central deterrence force that was also essentially capable of overwhelming spent systems. Think about how the Turks had, at least the Ottomans, had overrun the Mamluks, or how practically Mesopotamia had been Mesopotamian civilization had been obliterated since the Mongol distractions, or how, in fact, like North Africa was historically very much dependent on Europe and Western Europe rather than Constantinople, and how, again, so many other connections, even more far away ones we will see now, were really painting a much more complicated picture. Within this dynamic, however, the religious dimension, burdened by a history viewed predominantly, if not solely, through the prism of strife, stood out as the most vivid and decisive element. People who think that everything is about money, it's all about the greed of the elites and all this stuff, do not have a very realistic understanding of history for many reasons. Even if you understand properly, even the strictly modern secular dimension of politics, of war, of society, the religious dimension, the spiritual, the broadly moral one, that is all, in fact, a single element with the other factors, was historically and traditionally the most important aspect of it all, as it was especially tied with the imperium, and in fact with this universal struggle that, when you look at especially the Habsburgic, say the Holy Roman Empire at large, and the Ottoman struggle, you realize actually makes these two contendants much more central in the picture, because which other kind of universal powers existed in this regard, where you can't look at the rest of Europe and saying, well, there was another power within the Christian world that fundamentally deemed themselves as an alternative universal empire. No, it was, as we've seen also in recent videos since the Middle Ages, the idea that the Holy Roman Empire, for some reason, in its geographical dimension, had become the palm bearer, let's say, of the imperium, and as such should be considered, recognized, regardless of the rise of national monarchies, etc. The same goes for the Ottomans, that managed to fundamentally overrun, as we've seen, just most of their also Islamic neighbors on a regional and beyond a regional scale, and in fact, in this way, gaining enough consensus, after all, among their subjects to achieve a veritably universal dominance in their own regard. The conflict between Christian Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries and the Sultanic Empire centered in Constantinople, perceived by modern onlookers as a duel between the Cross and the Crescent, even more starkly than in earlier times, was nonetheless also not purely a clash between two religious institutions, or at least two religious institutions that could claim, again, a simple let's say, absolute control over their co-religionaries, as we just seen, and especially also that were necessarily seeing each other as the ultimate, say, reason to hostility between sort of different set of neighbors, also, in fact, of their same religion. Meaning what? That, of course, for the Holy Roman Empire or the Ottomans, the ultimate purpose was taking each other out, which would have been sort of the ultimate goal. But think about, taking Rome. Rome was under the general protection of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was not really technically part even of the Holy Roman Empire. The capture of Constantinople would have been also the major political and strategic goals of the Catholics. But aside from the fact that, France was out of the picture, and within the same Germany, there were some German subjects who were sabotaging the same Catholic cause. What about the relevance of Jerusalem? Yes, if Constantinople falls, Jerusalem does too, but it's mostly like a mean to an end. It's not like the reconquest of Constantinople was considered so central symbolically as, the reconquest of Jerusalem. So there are some shades here that are worth observing, especially when we consider how Christians, Jews, and Muslims, regardless of the grievances between one another, had sort of always recognized each other with greater distinction than they would do, for example, to the non-Abrahamites, who were also considered as pagans at large. So, and if we're not talking about heretics in many ways, so this was an issue actually starting since the Middle Ages, right? Dante would cleverly depict Muhammad, for example, as a schismatic bishop of some sort to explain, let's say, within a Western Christian perspective, what was the deep sin that Islam was embodying. But let's say similar issues were paralleled to, in fact, like heretical beliefs, and in many ways you can't just, in fact, interpret the relation with one another, but within what they respectively consider themselves the universality of their own world. I mean, in a Christian perspective, Christendom is the entirety of the world. It's just like, for Muslims, the Dar al-Islam. There is a sense of your own range of power that is metaphysical and ecumenic at the same time. It has to deal with these other elements that are immediately different and inferior to you, but in that sense are to be paradoxically taken as less seriously, especially when you're not under such a radical threat of annihilation, which may sound strange to say, but especially Christian Europe really wasn't, regardless of the incredibly serious Ottoman invasions. And in fact, historically, the Ottoman Empire was, as a system, weaker. I mean, it was, in many ways, historically a fresher power. It did, again, have this incredible expansive capacity at the beginning, but this was also riding the way, for example, of Byzantine civilization in its antagonism towards the Latin Christendom. On a relatively shorter run, like the Ottoman Empire, that was most of the time fighting on three fronts at a time, sort of began to run out of steam and became the great sick of Europe. So by also the end of the period we're browsing today, so there is a lot of inequality, as always, between these systems that we must understand. From one side, picturing the in fact, the centrality of the struggle for certain centuries, but also being able to contextualize this in the beginning and the end of it and its causes all throughout, right? In truth, Christians and Muslims, while harboring mutual hatred during their prolonged, violent, and at times ferocious battles across land and sea, whether along the waterways of the Aegean, Adriatic, or Tyrrhenian seas amid the Balkan hills and woodlands, or across the Danubian plains. This relentless brutality and determined reciprocal intent to annihilate each other is as intense as the one seen between the confrontations between Catholics and Huguenots in 16th century France, that I also made a video on, or between Papists and Reformists across Ireland, Scotland, and Central Europe in the subsequent century. We made many videos about the 30 Years' War. If anything, we'll have to increase the political, other just the military content about that topic. So there is no denying that the drawn-out martial struggles pitting Turks and Barbary pirates against Spaniards, Italians, Germans, and Poles took shape as wars that were definitely religious, and it's very superfluous to call these religious wars, meaning that wars had always been religious. For example, I've been paradoxically always opposite to this notion. I mean, if I have to talk about the religious aspect of these wars, it's granted that they were exclusively religious in many ways, but you can't say that there were at some point wars that were not religious. And so these were particularly more religious than the others. They were, because religion was such a big deal, and so we would be even shocked by the intensity of what it was, but that was completely the norm in the ancient and medieval, also in the modern world, and actually even today, depending on also how you define religion, even in kind of some post-traditional form, oddly enough. And so there is a clash between hominis religiosi, so religious men, individuals of different faiths that were historically, theologically, and morally foreign to one another, and between two contrasting societal models. This is also extremely important, both of which anchored their worldviews, legal systems, and collective ethics in faith. Pretty much all what we said about the differences between Latin Germanic world and the Byzantine one in the Middle Ages are true for the same surviving Western Christendom and the Ottomans. How do you understand, for example, the Janissaries? If you don't understand what slavery is in Islam, for example, what kind of adoptive relation there can be between these soldiers and the Sultan, as also kidnapped children of Christians brainwashed into the new faith, with all the fanatism that you can imagine. This is the deep consequence of for example, the sclerotization of the societal system in the Ottoman world was not as nearly entrepreneurial, dynamic, and qualitatively productive, so to say, compared to the West. This is something you can notice to an extent also in the armies. For example, the Westerners developed pike and shot warfare, whereas the Ottomans more or less remained with the shot, supported, you could say, the arrow shot warfare in that regard, but never had really a very strong infantry compared to Western one, very few pike. Also in there, if you do not see sort of the level of egalitarian liberty that large European townfolk had, also in a political and institutional point of view compared to the Balkans, the East in general, you cannot understand why the Ottomans could not really have that middle estate capable of fielding final rank soldiers, capable of being disciplined and also autonomously trained and armed for allowing such tactics to develop on the battlefield. Equally, like if you don't live in the steppes, you really can't have strong horse archery, which at large the Westerners did not have, right? Even though at some point it would be a meeting point, and there had actually always been. And there are areas, in fact, other European areas, think about Hungary, etc., that are steppified by the Ottoman conquest, also because their state basically exploded. So Hungary, of course, had always some steppe bias, but it had heavily westernized The Poles are a good example, as they fully established their union with what was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and, with this incredibly large east-stretching world into the steppes, the wild plains, etc. They, from like a 15th century, was basically virtually fully westernized system. Like they inject a lot of more cavalry compared to the West, a lot of horse archers. You can't really unsee how important that was, and the outcomes are different, right? For example, the famed Polish winged hussars were an anachronism of success, at times desperately but successfully charging against the same Western pikes, right, supported by shot, which was not something that Westerners did normally by themselves either. Nevertheless, the two opposing sides, though far from uniform, could clearly identify with their respective religious symbolic frameworks. A duel between cross and crescent, both envisioned here with initial capitals. This comes with a qualification, however. While the cross undeniably embodies Christianity and Christendom with clarity, there isn't really an alternative to that. Like, there are crosses, of course, in India. There are swastikas. There is the old symbols, solar symbols of we also discussed with the Lictorian axe and Thor's one, etc. But in Islam, you don't really have that, right? In part, that's because Muslims have that kind of ingrained sense that crosses are used by Christians at large. And there is all a symbolism with the cross that in part matches with some relative an-iconism, especially the Arab world. In fact, not much the Turkic one is sort of more zoomorphic and phytomorphic from an early age. Nevertheless, the crescent or lunar sickle carries actually a much more intricate and less straightforward historical symbolic weight. Lacking in Islam the singular foundation and deep significance the cross holds for Christians. Have you ever thought about this? Like, Islam is not uniquely identified by actually any specific symbol. Because of the aforementioned tendentially an-iconism stemming from the Quran prescriptions themselves. The cross, of course, manifests itself in varied forms and designs, frequently competing or clashing. Think about, again, the difference between Latin and Greek Christendom, so to say. So if not outright warring with one another at some point in history, owing to its heraldic and emblematic roles and its many iterations, some dating back centuries across the diverse branches of the Christian faith. But that cross is the properest symbol of Christendom, reinforced by a strong Catholic symbolism that existed again since Rome. The Lictorian axe, I made an entire video explaining how the Lictorian axe is actually like the progenitor of the cross, just as, again, Thyr's hammer and more. But that's something, if anything, we'll discuss in another video. But there is a deep European conviction. It's not just about the symbol per se, but we've seen it many times, especially in the videos about medieval knighthood. There is a millenary continuity in Catholic symbolism from pre- and Christian world that people have literally no clue of, unfortunately, living in the modern and secular world. Again, the crescent is slightly different, meaning that actually this was even a more universal symbol to a degree, and as such is also unambiguously Christian, especially today as a consequence of that clash between Catholics and Ottomans that we'll understand now. In fact, it would be a compelling exercise from our perspective to explore how, when, and why the moon, specifically the crescent moon, inaccurately termed mezzaluna in Italian, referring to the crescent or montante in heraldry, known as the Bilal among Arabs, emerged as the foremost symbol of Islam. Right? The crescent is incredibly old. It dates back to the Sumerian times. It was a Mesopotamian symbol. It was used practically by everybody, famously enough, by the Byzantines. Right? I made some videos explaining that also in Balkan heraldry, for that matter. It's, of course, augural symbolism. It's the idea of a rising power, of some nascent force, mostly connected also with the morning, with the idea of a new dawn, of some sort of a new era, right? And so it cannot be typically Islamic just per se, especially considering it was used by Christians and Europeans from a long time. I mean, we have seen it also in the video about the signifer, right? The Romans used the crescent very often, also in a military context. So it's really nothing strange at all. Evident in numerous cults and symbolic traditions of the ancient Levant and pre-Islamic Arabia. The crescent was only under the Ottomans that it progressively took on the mantle of an Islamic emblem, to such an extent that today, for instance, we casually refer to the Middle Ages as a struggle between the cross and the crescent, even though this latter symbol, while present, held no especial prominence in Islamic emblematics and was used by many Christian houses all over Europe. We've seen it used, for example, in the video about the Italian communes. There are also the Catalans used this. You find it in England, in Germany, so it's really ubiquitous. Nor does it seem that in the European imagination before the 15th century bore a meaning unequivocally and exclusively linked, in fact, to anything connected to Islam in a conventional sense by a moment which the Turks were now on the stage. For example, there are mentions of Turkish crescents surfacing in connection with, for example, Piero della Francesca's fresco Legend of the Cross in St. Francis in Arezzo. There is definitely an imitation that starts occurring. Like the Westerners start looking back at the classical past. They are exposed to the Ottomans. They revisit this alchemic, astronomical / astrological symbolism. There is an arcane, sort of paganistically flirting, at least pre-Christian flirting, attraction, revival that is really typical of the Renaissance. So any kind of provocation, even in sacred art, is somehow, however, still connected with, in fact, the original meaning of the crescent that now was gaining more interest. The moon, as we explained, symbolizes transformation. By the way, the feminine essence tied to the menstrual cycle and also inconstancy and lunacy. So in this light, it could be embraced in Christian circles as a pejorative emblem of Islam, a religion of irrationality. Yet within Christian settings, the lunar crescent also enjoyed a positive interpretation, seen as a mark of glory and renown, signifying the rise of reputation and regard. We know, after all, that countless times, if you want to divinely transfigure, the subjugation of the female chthonic element is necessarily an organic part of virile affirmation, struggle, and victory. In fact, again, we will talk about the symbol of the Virgin stepping over the crescent that we've seen also many times in the iconography, in the videos about the siege of Vienna in 1683. So by that point, being a perfect example of victory, actually, over the devil, but still as the heavenly transfigured feminine fury, right, as the soul of chivalry that managed to, in fact, transcend into a Valkyrie, into Victoria, that brings the victorious hero to heaven. So it's a deeply dual meaning that could have never disappeared within the Christian world, even when fighting against some Islamic foes that so frequently displayed the same iconography on their banners. René of Anjou established even an order of the Crescent in the 15th century. Right, it was an age of great military, sort of knightly revival under a mystical, again, classicistic aura. And this order explicitly referenced the ascent and broadening of glory and fame for its recipients. So the Crescent was already, by that point, quite firmly established within Christian heraldry as part of Western identity. In fact, many prominent families, we were mentioning them before in Italy, the Sienese, Piccolomini. So these are famous ones, the Tolomei, the Florentine, Strozzi, Canigiani, Pazzi. At least up to the 15th century, the Govoni and others included their crescent in their heraldic arms. A golden lunar crescent set against a starry blue background appears among the imagined coats of arms of the Magi in artworks from the 15th century onward. This could also be, again, a broader call to the east. By the way, the rising sun in general, we could talk about that in a historical perspective, was historically associated with the east. There is a dualism there, again, all an astrological and astronomical arcanism regarding the influence of such celestial bodies on the life of people. But what most people do not know, or at least nobody told them, is that astrology was perfectly legal in medieval Christendom. We're often told, oh my God, this was such, superstition that nobody believed in it. It's a completely different thing. In tradition, astrology means essentially things, it's just like numerology, like things are just a reflection of each other, right? So it's not like you're passively conferred the influence of a celestial body because you're born in that moment, right? Let's skip other physical considerations aside. You are the one who, by universal order, have been born in that circumstance exactly because those influences were aligned, right? This is how they saw it. And in fully Christian, say, Orthodox context where heretics were burned at the stake, etc., there were official public astrologers that governments consulted, and they were perfectly legal as long as they didn't claim anything against the Bible. There was nothing wrong in their work. So also the notion that in traditional religion there was practically no space, that this was an age of obscurantism against any other kind of belief. It's just a modernistic and secularistic prejudice. If people had just a basic historical and religious education, they would absolutely know and understand all this. One could make the point that, again, these symbols were more chthonic. Say the moon, of course, is more chthonic, associated with Cancer, with water, etc. There is that thing. So it's possible that the original meaning of certain, knights or towns that were using this symbol was chthonic in nature, but you find it everywhere. Like half of heraldry represents chthonic symbols, half Apollonian. They're often mixed, by the way, because, again, this was part of a corporatively organic hierarchy of values that reflected the true essence of all, in fact, the elements constituting it in a divinely ordained way, which is what people today have difficulty in understanding, just as much as they have difficulty in understanding how and why, again, Christian and Islam could clash against one another furiously, but also have all those more constructive contexts at this point. Just like today, in many ways, regardless of the ineliminable fracture, opposition, enmity that their respective positions towards one another unavoidably entail. To prove the ancient connection between Christianity and the Crescent, another example, the apocalyptic vision of the lady, quote, robed in the sun with the moon beneath her feet, right? Hence the later, but even also the older symbolism, right? I made a video about, for example, the Indo-European origin, the 3rd century BC, like also archaeological iconography of what would become St. George's nightly imagery. This stuff was around since ever. And the lady of the apocalypse is long understood as Mary prevailing over the Antichrist, that, of course, had historically by this point tied the Antichrist to Islam as well. So this interpretation grew widespread and familiar following especially the Battle of Lepanto, that at some point I will make a glorious video on, dedicated to the Virgin of the Rosary. There is a beautiful iconography in some paintings that is a real thing and very beautiful, in which you see the Virgin on a cloud above the battle water of Lepanto that is throwing some balls that look dark, like they look like grenades, right? And in the intent of the painter, that was to look exactly like that, because those are actually rosary grains, but that look like literally we're throwing grenades at those damn Turks, right? Even the Virgin does that. That's basically all one with the idea of the Virgin that crashes the Crescent. In that also transfigurably victorious Virgin, you know what that means. Like, I will have to make a video about the soul of chivalry, but again, that's essentially the darkest, more chthonic parts of your souls transfigured, like the alter ego of this war, the Durandal of Roland, that he loves more than his own woman, right? It's just that heavenly maiden that allows you to be your perfect self as a man, that makes you achieve, in fact, heaven through self-sacrifice into holy combat. Think about the fields again, the Valkyries, Victoria, Nike, and so on. Equally, like St. George slaying the dragon, the snake. And so from that moment onwards, especially, like we are at the end of the 16th century, the moon shifted in this Catholic Ottoman struggle from being a pedestal under the lofty Virgin's feet to an anonymous emblem of the enemy she crushed. Right? It became all one. You had it literally in the Apocalypse. Now the Turks use the same symbol. Of course, the Virgin will crush the same. It's perfect, right? You don't even have to fix it. You don't have to force the connection there. A 13th century Joachimite work, this was borderline orthodox to say the least. We will talk more about the Joachimites. I did something so in the video about the legacy of St. Francis that tells you, as you know, what happened. Also, the Studium of Paris, it was a great scandal for the survival, essentially, of an heretic sect within the Franciscan order, still pretty late in time. At the time of Bonaventure's generalship. In any case, this work, this medieval work, the Expositio in Apocalypsim, literally, posits that the Antichrist, in the 6th stage of the Age of the Sun, the Joachimites had all a specific chronological scanning. They thought basically that the Age of the Spirit would have been the last one, and so the Age of the Sun would have to conclude, in their theory, with Frederick II. That would have been Satan himself in their view. Again, we'll talk about this. And so they scanned in turn this various eras. And so in the 6th stage of the Age of the Sun, the Antichrist was Saladin, right? So because it would have passed through different historical figures and enemies of the faith. As you know, Saladin also made a video about the Battle of Hattin, recaptured Jerusalem for the Muslims in 1187, seizing it from, of course, the Christian hands of the king of Jerusalem that was also captured in the battle. Furthermore, another Joachimite text, the Liber Figurarum, casts the prophet Muhammad as the Antichrist, a view echoed by Innocent III himself in 1213 when he urged Christians to crusade, equating Muhammad with the beast of the apocalypse. If you are interested in Innocent III's contributions to the full affirmation of Western Christendom, to the glorious extent it came to universal rule, even coming to establish a Latin patriarch in Constantinople, check out the videos I made also about the Albigensian Crusade, the Cathars, and so on, because we're looking there at a very deep theological wisdom. I mean, Innocent III was the strongest pope in the history of mankind, and there is a reason if he expressed himself so precisely, given the ultimate purpose of the crusade, also the accomplishments of Las Navas. This was just the year after, for example, the great Reconquista triumph that would have not really been possible without his coordination. Well, all these ideas, now we're going by example, but you understand, like so renewed prominence and dissemination between the 15th and the 16th centuries of the notion that, of course, the Muslims were the Antichrist, and so that the Virgin was to crush the same symbol represented in the Apocalypse by the Antichrist and waved, in fact, by the Muslims, almost immediately in their history, because again, we know that the Byzantines, the Sasanians, so the early Islamic enemies, used the same. We know it pretty well from the early Islamic iconography as well. It was imitating them, needless to say. Yet, despite the stance of Annio da Viterbo in his 1480 treaty, De Futuris Christianorum Triumphis in Saracenas, which means on the about the future Christian triumphs against the Saracens, the Jesuit Benito Pereira in the early 17th century dismissed the notion that Islam's founder could be the Antichrist, for reasons that also were not to digress on, because in fact it would have conferred too much power to Islam to begin with. Broadly, the Catholic sphere resisted this association, fearing it would disrupt the eschatological timeline, anticipating the Antichrist's arrival at the world's end as well. Protestant perspectives were more varied, enabled by the diversity of churches and scholarly traditions that foster debate and feasible within Catholicism, but also, in fact, wildly disagreeing with one another. So that's what, the disadvantages of like this nonsensical arbitrariness that I just made a video recently about, like in the very, like expounding the exact meaning of the cross as God's law, as a limit to that kind of random, I wish to think that I'm so special that I can think about God whatever the hell I want without tradition, without church, without authority, without hierarchy, and so on. In any case, later, the famous humanist and polymath Tommaso Campanella would vigorously underscore the link between crusades and eschatology, tying the defeat of an Islamic antichrist to the dawn of a millenarian realm. Just consider that Columbus had literally sailed from Spain in order to establish an alliance with the Great Khan, that would be ruling in China, to essentially convert them to Christianity and crush together the Muslims. Right? If you had asked him, that was the first goal in international terms. as we've seen in other videos, crusades were a big deal up to very late in time, the 17th, the 18th century. Holy War and the Christian-Islamic struggle should never be downplayed in this dynamics. Yes, we said it before, there were many other reasons and modes these powers were interacting, not just open warfare, sometimes even cooperation. However, the ultimate view that Christendom had developed of itself within the universe, of course, contemplated this typical Western confidence in oneself to the point that they do not even feel bothered by thinking that there can be any other ending by, for example, the destruction of Islam, and something that is in fact so faulty as it looks, and that, however, is as important, as big to constitute some broader metaphysical, eschatological issue. It was in the 16th century, however, that the lunar crescent embarked on its irresistible rise, as suggested by the same symbol, as an emblem of both the Ottoman Empire and Islam at large. You start finding it prominently depicted within the same Western iconography. On one level, it stood in opposition to the Virgin Mary, envisioned again as the woman of the apocalypse who treads upon the gleaming nocturnal sickle while smashing the serpent's head. I sleep in a room with a fluorescent symbol of the Virgin destroying the Antichrist. On another, it came to signify potent courage, and was already paired, in fact, by French poets during Louis XIII's era with the sun, emblem of the French monarchy. Right? Remember those imperialistic Gallican ambitions. Remember also the sun-moon metaphor of the empire and the papacy. The virile and the feminine principle, right? That are complementary and must have this cooperative yet also antagonistic, provocatory at least, stimulating relation. This is deep, right? Also against a broader enemy. There are different anecdotes culturally. For example, we mentioned the Duke of Nevers, example, like there was in other videos, anyhow, Father Joseph's Crusade, etc. There was a prevalent belief again that Islam was fated to fall. There's this work, the Ballet de l'amour de Septembre, dated to 1620, extolling the harmony of the two celestial entities, sun and moon, says, puisque le soleil et la lune ont coutume de s'accorder. Right, so there is always this traditional understanding that the symbols are there for a reason. They're not for annihilating one another, but to complement one another in a harmonic hierarchy, where every element contributes to the fulfillment of the other in the metaphysical meaning. Now, the cross and the crescent stand as essential symbols and key players, though in distinct manners. However, they fall short, even on a purely emblematic level, of capturing the intricate web of forces active across the extended time frame we are examining. This mirrors the scenario seen in magnificent cartographic charts, such as the Portolani, crafted within 14th to 16th century manuscripts, often adorning the walls of noble residences, as well as veritable murales of some sort, where shores and isles are studded with striking flags, occasionally as the realms and rulers of Inner Asia or Africa, bearing invented yet not whimsical emblems rooted instead in a rich and enduring cultural heritage. This is really typical. We often made videos also represent, especially when we talk about the Mediterranean, have other videos incoming. You know that the Westerners were very ahead in cartography. Here I already inserted, as you've seen, some pictures Cartography really started with coastal navigation because it was much easier, of course, to get the points of reference to delineate the coastlines rather than the interland that before, especially flying balloons, were quite difficult to see in perspective. And you see all these flags that are based, in fact, on local heraldry and quite accurately depict the local polities. Again, inserted here lots of pictures because they, in fact, display all these suns and moons and crosses, etc. So these are really a very precious and, I think, eloquent source for today's topic. And so you see, amidst these, also beside crosses and crescents, appearing in diverse forms and hues that unmistakably signify the leading powers wielding authority and dominion from Cadiz and Mogador and Timbuktu, Constantinople, Kazan, Isfahan, Samarkand. So it's literally also like these were on the Silk Route. So they had been known historically. Even Delhi, right, with oceanic routes being opened and or just being reachable through the Ottoman Empire, as it often happened. Like all those wars between the Turks and the Venetians were also separated by truces that were de facto pieces, which both began to trade with one another, especially as, the Portuguese or the Dutch were, generally speaking, making the Mediterranean traffics slightly less profitable. So there is here so much in perspective. For example, the black twin-headed eagles of the Habsburgs and Romanovs that historically had also been connected with the Byzantine Empire. I mean, the Seljuk Turks themselves had this notion of the East and the West. You see here the steppes influences also from the older Indo-European symbolism. They're always there. They're always recognized, even at distance of centuries or millennia, as that sort of universal symbol, right? And each of these powers, as we were saying before, regardless of by whom they were recognized, tried to assert their claim to the Roman Empire's ecumenic inheritance in the partes occidentis and orientis of post-Theodosian lore, respectively, even though at some point these were just wishful thinking to some degree, as nobody had necessarily recognized one power even as universal outside of itself, especially after, like the decline of the same universal authorities of the same Holy Roman Empire, by the way. You have the white single-headed eagle of the Res Publica Polonorum that has a beautiful legend behind, like the founder of Poland arrived in this land at sunset, and the sunlight illuminated this white eagle right against a red sky, which is literally the arms of Poland. And by the way, all these peoples had, even as you see, an eagle as its symbol, right? Since Rome, like these were all like Indo-European powers in legacy, and they perfectly remember what that utmost Apollonian symbol really was. We talk very often about Indo-European mythology, and you perfectly know why the eagle is there. There isn't just this. With especially the rise of national monarchies, you do have more sort of customized symbolisms taking over at a regional level. For example, France's golden fleur de lis, paired with Louis XIV's ubiquitous solar motive, its remarkable relevance in the latter 17th century undeniable, as Galileo's heliocentrism had just gained acceptance, infusing the French king's chosen symbol with exceptional depth, right? And the fleur de lis have also a very old symbol considered that is not just about Galileo's heliocentrism, but think about the Montjoie, Saint-Denis, the Oriflamme. And so that older symbol that it's also relatively difficult to decipher, at least in the absence of explicit historical sources, and that, however, it's always part of the same solar centrality, also part, in fact, of the Indo-European legacy, because the eagle does really look at the sun god in the eye. That's the only animal can really do that. The fleur de lis, again, having a different symbol that is more specifically associated with France, that, however, is also golden, and so it's also solar in meaning. And such heraldry had really become like the top image of nobility, of chivalry under the French, that now, by the way, under Louis XIV, were resuming, as an hegemonic continental role as the dominant Christian power in the continent. You had the winged lion of Saint Mark. That is also pretty old. It's tied, of course, to the Gospels, but it also has some, in fact, older meaning. The Gospel of Saint Mark was more specifically dedicated to the Romans, right? Among the various peoples, the gentiles at large, and as such, it also bore some greater significance, right? Reigning still, by the way, over the Eastern Mediterranean, at some point managing to strike back against the same Turks outside of the Holy Roman Empire. That's an interesting aspect. Yet paralleling and somewhat rivaling across Europe and the Atlantic with the lions of England, Holland, and Sweden. Right, lion being, of course, very much there. There are also the more modest lion of Tuscany's Medici Grand Dukes as lords of Florence, dubbed the Marzocco, that was, in this sense, elevated historically, as you know, the Medici had the spheres representing even there like some celestial, wealth acquired by also their historical banking craft, but not only because they were also properly noblemen themselves. And if you look further east, not even too far away, beyond the Caucasus and Euphrates, you have the solar lion of Persia's Safavid Shahs, Shia Muslims, as the lion is also the widespread emblem among Central Asian rulers. That's in part the connection, but especially in the Shia tradition, it distinctly honors the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law Ali, called Haidar, in fact, the lion. In fact, at this point, by the way, Haidar was the name of the Safavid sheikh who died in 1488, who, inspired by a dream, adopted Ali's red turban, a practice followed by Persian Shia in Turkey as well, because there were there as well the Ottoman Empire and fighting against it, earning, in fact, them the Turkish moniker Redhairs, the Kizilbash. You understand how widespread these symbols were, and think about it, because when you think about heraldry, you don't normally get into also the Islamic one, but I made a video about the Mamluk rank emblems that were some sort of Islamic heraldic version. As Egypt, as we've seen, it was a bit more of a westernized system, a bit more stabilized, one that sort of more fleeting Islamic one in general. We will talk more. I also made a video about, kite-shaped shields from the 11th century's heraldry, say, looking at mostly the Bayeux tapestry symbolism. And so there is all a series I make about heraldry as well. We talk again about the Balkan one that, if you look at, is very, very mixed. Like, as you know, the Moldovans had there are many powers having the Crescent there as well, together with the werewolf. That's yet another association with the moon. Knight warriors, brotherhoods of, again, wolves that were children of the night, and so rising the hierarchy of the military power through those practices. We know that some kumans, for example, before battle, with shamanic practices, literally owled to the moon to get back some sort of feedback on the outcome of the battle. The Ottomans that supplant the still Sunni Mamluk, by the way, sultans of Egypt, vanquished by Selim I, in fact, more specifically between 1516 and 1518. So definitely as foes of Constantinople's Ottoman sultans within the Dar al-Islam, largely the Mamluks had informed the same Ottoman politics and sort of broader cultural influence. Selim I ruled from 1512 to 1520, by the way. In 1513, he reaffirmed truce pacts with Venice and nearly forged an alliance with her. Right, so you have essentially there were crescents also in Mamluk, this shared symbols used by different enemies and allies of different religions, not just of confessions, that somehow paradoxically aligned for their different and distinct traditional branches. Beyond the Mediterranean, Selim's gains and those of his successor Suleiman, 1520-1566, encompassed access to the Red Sea, thus to the Indian Ocean, by 1517. You have the seizure of Suakin, Sudan, in 1520. We recently talked about Christian African warfare that also prominently represents the lion. Also from biblical legacy. We talked about this also in the video about Italian fascism, when the empire was affirmed with the conquest of Ethiopia, and how the lion literally was deported to Rome as a symbol of victory. And so just think about how recent this concept, this iconography really are. The Persian lions were defeated at the Battle of Calderan. By the way, the same Suleiman conquered Mesopotamia, Iraq, like he took over Basra in 1538, which also granted the Ottomans a Persian Gulf outlet. Also, he established in Eritrea's Massawa in 1554. These clashes reached the Indian Ocean, sparking war with the Portuguese, who controlled its trade lanes. In 1569, an Ottoman fleet crossed the ocean to aid the Sultanate of Aceh against the Portuguese in Sumatra even. So when you look at this in perspective, you realize just to how much culture all these powers were really exposed not to gain, for example, a universal awareness of heraldic symbolism and what these various cultures sort of all were connected with. The Bosphorus masters at this point posed such a grave danger for the Saint Christians that this awareness of symbolism escalated. Right, this perpetually poised, at least theoretically, but not only, to join forces with Western Europe's Christians or Muscovites to encircle the sprawling sultanate extending from the Balkans to Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. These are the players arrayed across this vast tableau of strategic confrontation, each with their own pawns, with their own symbol, with their own iconography, with their own face. Right. So these lands are known. We see the token's position. And as you know from Clausewitz, the second element of the Trinity, the military properly, enjoys gamble, dice rolling. The game of risk is definitely the point that all these powers were playing, aware of the fact that they could rise and fall pretty easily. We sort of get used to how history goes, but in the moment, many things can really change. And this is for this reason that we should also, from a moral a psychological point of view, appreciate how and why symbology is so important, because it's as if this was the only guarantee of eternity. The continuum of this symbolism is in itself the promise of eternal glory and victory, the escape from death, the gaining of eternal life. And in the ways it manifests, in the way these symbols are represented, they all point to us and tell us, look, that powers may rise and fall, may be born or be destroyed, but these meanings remain the same, they remain unaltered. And so this unadulteration is really the foundation of tradition, that the doctrine of the two natures, the perennial heavenly one that makes you really wonder about this samsara that life really is, and that is also objectively scary if you don't know how to maintain your compass of moral and scientific values. And I would like to conclude with some further notion, that is to say that if you're really interested in crosses, crescents, etc., you can get a pretty good insight into the era's heraldic emblematic conventions by consulting the plates of an almost not really unsuspectable source, but one that you wouldn't really imagine to be so aligned with tradition, given its mostly Enlightenment, but still old enough, as we understand here evidently, ethos. That is Diderot and d'Alembert Encyclopédie, right, where the lunar crescent, especially as a mark of the Ottoman Empire, is firmly established already, again, in that modern secular view, saying, okay, well, now we categorize everything. Remember that this is what the Enlightenment really was, categorizing everything, not really understanding much of the meaning anymore, but still, like in this case, being fully aware, where in the 18th centuries, like being able to say, look, this is exactly the power that we identify with this kind of symbol. And of course, mostly you find this exquisitely detailed etchings therein that are, if anything, just the exact point here. They admired it so much. They didn't care so much about. They cared about the symbol first, in an encyclopedistic sense, but they couldn't avoid to separate it per antonomasia, let's say, from the Ottoman Empire. As such, when looking at all this arcanism, that surely we will get a bit more into the depths of, because I realize that you're, I don't know, I'm personally very fascinated. I have something, I would have confessions to make regarding this occult background, but I will keep it for other videos. But in general, you understand that you must, this is occult just to the degree, as I always say, it's occult to people, not occult for some other strange sense. It's mostly ignorance, and you have always to combat that. But at large, when you acknowledge it, when you feel that there is more to know, exploring these realms becomes definitely. I was reading horrifying comments, like I will refuse to repeat them about. I can't even say what this was about, but yeah, that's also Schwerpunkt's experiences, especially at the end of the video, randomly getting into the. I lack an occult branch of the cycle. You can find lots of stuff in history of religion. But I just don't like the concept of occult in the way people mostly conventionally understand it, because it's not anti-traditional at all. It's not anti-Christianity or whatever. It's something very different. Nevertheless, in order to continue this work, we must at least talk a bit more about also the Renaissance history, getting a bit more into the mindset, the clashes. And so I have a 16th century, especially playlist, that we've been, filling over time. And if you look at it, you realize that there is no doubt some sense of, like, look at these people that are so far apparently, but also relatively close, to the point of making us realize how close ourselves we are to such beliefs that were so rampant at the time. So this is mostly the point I'm making on Schwerpunkt. For the rest, what else to say? Well, probably not much. I'm going to go a bit more into history of religions than the usual, but we have mostly also lots of military history to make, which is excruciatingly important. I'm glad the channel is growing a bit faster than it usually does. It's always good to see when things rise, skyrocket in a way, at times even. And this was a fairly good video I intended to make from a while. We're following our usual. I have an incredible amount of videos here that are already prepared. I tell you how many. I have reserved so that I can simply at some point stop. This doesn't count how many objects they are. They are, I think, yes, here it should be easy to count them. These are 17, 34, 51. So obviously for the 51, 68, 67, 66, 65. We are, even if I stop preparing material in over 2 months, I would still have to talk. This is, thank God, what I managed to do, because sometimes some videos are very demanding. Others are more like, well, you prepare them with some relative ease, and this is, generally speaking, what allows, because normally I prepare one a day. Sometimes I can't because I have other things to do, but over time it's more the ones you can make double in a day, because maybe it takes just 5 minutes to make them for all other, for example, images that I have already saved and stored. So that's why things are improving, because we're really getting to the point everything is pre-planned to an important degree. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.